On the other hand, there's this cartoon. So no matter what you think, it may not turn out that way. So the best we can do in terms of using things like trends and predictions and patterns is to say, okay, this is what we think's happening based on these figures, this data. We think this is a possibility, but be prepared for other possibilities you hadn't thought of. And the other thing, be really wary of people who talk about exponential curves. Every exponential curve, because people talk about this, that it's taking off an exponential curve, it's going so fast that, tomorrow it's going to be doubled and all that stuff. Every exponential curve is an S curve, in that eventually, at some point, it has to taper off. So we're really talking in exponential curves that we're at the tipping point where something's about to take off. It's not going to go on like that forever. It's going to go like that. And somewhere out there, there's somebody else starting a new curve. And that new curve may in fact disrupt your product, may trash your product, may make your product redundant. Okay? Whaling, for example, there was a big market on whale oil. It wasn't because they ran out of whales that they stopped using whale oil. It's because they discovered oil in the ground in great quantities and it was redundant. Nobody wanted it anymore. So these things can happen and all of a sudden you're hit by a wave of change. But that means somebody out there starting a curve that's very different than the one that you may be on. Now the third way to create, or to predict the future is to create it yourself. This is a device from Pascal Katana in Africa. And he used spare parts that he got from probably, I'm not sure where he got them, from various devices, but he put this together as a fish detector and hooked it up to his fishing net, so when it was full, it would actually dial his mobile phone and tell him when the net was full. Nice idea. I put it up because we also need to remember that some of the best ideas of new uses, of new innovations, don't come from our own culture. They come often outside. And the reason is that we tend to look ahead, and even when we have a vision, that vision is informed by who we are, what culture we're in, what our present goals are. And if you want to really be new, sometimes it's a good idea to walk out and see another culture, to have a look at other people who have a different perspective to see what they are creating using the same kinds of technologies. So those are three ways of creating the future, of predicting the future. And once you do that, then you at least have some information. But let's go back a little bit on the history. And so, again, I'm sure some of you think in terms of mobile learning is sort of the latest thing that came up maybe 2 or 3 years ago. The beginning of mobile is around 1910 in terms of mobile phones. The idea of mobile goes before that, right, in terms of carrier pigeons and so on. But Hilda Ericsson, from the famous Ericsson name of Ericsson mobile phones, Hilda had her husband take their telephone, and he had 2 poles and hook them up to the telephone wires, and she could call from the car in 1910. So it's a 100-year-old idea. Excuse me. And we can go through here various kinds of radio devices, and this is a radio phone up here, to cellular telephones to what we have today. A good illustration that this technology has now had 100 years of development, not the last 5 years, even though we may only have become aware of it in that time period. The other thing that's happening is this tremendous growth, because we've gone from landlines, in 2010, 1.2 billion landlines to 5.0 billion mobile or wireless subscriptions in the world. And that's greatly increasing as well, and so it will wipe out a lot of the landlines. Much of that growth has been in developing countries, as we see from this graph from Ericsson, I believe. And so we should pay attention to that if we're in the business of developing apps. Where's your market? It may not be here. Or maybe here, but you might want to think how you're going to modify it for other markets. And we've changed. Our culture's become more nomadic. We're moving around a lot more. This may stop once the oil is peaked and becomes so expensive we don't want to drive a lot, but we're a very nomadic culture. I say we if I'm a North American, about Canada and the United States.
And this is an article, or actually a special report from The Economist in 2008 about the new nomadism.
We also become very attached to our phones. This is a new disease, nomophobia. Can't find your phone.
And there's a mobile phone anxiety
Advice center on the internet. But you know, we all laugh. My wife teaches at York University in Toronto. She can't get the students to turn their phones off. She can only get them to put them on vibrate. So she says to them, why can't you just turn them off? Well, then we miss being connected. Right? So it's a real thing. It's a real emotional thing to be connected to other people. And maybe it's a substitute for being, or maybe it's a cure for not being connected in other ways in this society that we're in. Now, the idea of mobile learning and mobile devices is being driven by special drivers, including sales is one of the most common groups. And when I say you don't need to do mobile learning, it all depends on the mix you have of employees as to whether it makes sense. If you have a lot of salespeople who are out there, then it may make sense. Or field work. There's a famous story about a group of copier service technicians in England, and they would service, I'm not sure what brand, maybe it was Xerox, maybe it was Konica Minolta, I don't know, but they would service their copiers, and once a week they would meet in a local pub, and they would discuss what they had done for the week. There's my phone going off. We're going to ignore it. They would discuss what they'd done for the week, what problems they'd run into, what solutions they'd come up with, because they're often idiosyncratic solutions. And they would write them down in a book. And the bartender, the pub owner, would keep the book behind the bar. Right? And people have that need to collaborate and to come up with solutions and then make them available and share them with other people. So this is another group that's really driving mobile learning. Another thing that's driving nomadism and mobile learning is the fact that we now have what's called third spaces. We go to coffee shops. We go to the park with our mobile phones and sit and talk to people. Right? So we used to have home and work, and now we have these third spaces that are being set up as places to work, where you can get your basic needs met. There's a washroom, there's coffee, and there's a table. Right? Excuse me. So all that is adding up to what Sam Atkins calls a perfect storm for mobile learning adoption. And that's a diagram from one of his reports. And you don't have to read this. I know you're not supposed to put a lot of text up, but in the book, in my book, I've identified about 36 applications for mobile learning, and this is a list of them. Excuse me. So there's many applications, but they aren't all futuristic. And the reason for that is when we start getting new technology, what Marshall McLuhan says is we look at the present through a rearview mirror and we march backwards into the future. So the first thing that we do is we get this new technology and we say, oh, I can do X on it, which is the stuff I used to do in another way. Right? And I think that's the first generation of mobile learning is like that. And the old metaphor, what we base it on, is the classroom. And this is the extreme of the classroom. Most people don't know that classrooms were invented in Prussia in the 1770s as ways of immobilizing people, getting their asses into a seat and having them not move and pay attention to the teacher. Immobilize. That's the opposite of mobile. So if you're using classroom metaphors for mobile learning, there's a contradiction here. Does that make sense? This is based on something called monitorial education, where they believed in the 1800s that you could actually educate up to 1,000 students in one room by having monitors watch down each aisle, and you had a whistle, and you blew a whistle, and the students would all do exactly the same thing. You blew another whistle, they'd do the next thing, and you'd make sure the monitors would make sure nobody was out of line. And it was a very mechanical, factory-like kind of system, but it was popular for about 30 or 40 years when they found it was a bit too much. So we came back to sort of the regular classroom environment that many of us grew up with. But based on that metaphor, we have developed what I call conventional uses for mobile learning. These are things that are based on the idea that we have of managing people in the classroom. Things like instructional supports, that we're putting lectures up on mobile phones. I tell people we know how to bore you in a classroom, now we know how to bore you online. It's not a lot of progress. Personal organizers, LMSs on mobile, there's a bunch of those. And assessments, again, based on the old tell test. Tell that person this, take a test whether they memorized it. And that's the model that we've grown up with for 300 years, and that's our first impulse to put that up. So what I want to do today is actually show you 16 other possibilities for mobile learning, and then I want to look at some futuristic kind of things that are not here yet, but they're in development. Now what's different about the new things is that they use what I call the affordances of mobile devices. By the way, anyone wants this presentation, I can give it to them on a stick after. So you don't really take too much stuff down. If you've got a computer, we can just plug it in. But the point is that affordances of mobile are the opposite of the classroom. They include mobility, moving around, ubiquity, the fact that you can find it everywhere, that it's accessible. The data that you want is accessible when you want it. Right? That we're connected to people. That means we can share things with people. We're not independent on the expert instructor that's in front of the classroom. And we start looking at where people are at, who they are, what their location is, what their needs are, what their patterns are, and use that information in terms of delivering better stuff for them. And so it becomes personal and individualized. None of that is what most of us have grown up with in the classrooms. Little bits of it here and there, but mostly it's a standard curriculum taken in a standard way and presented so that we all are supposed to learn the same thing at the end. One of the reasons it's changing is that there's just way too much. There's too much to do it that way. First of all, you can't get that stuff up in the teachers' heads because there's way too much stuff. Then they can't get it out. And then it turns out to be irrelevant. I took Latin in school. I haven't used it lately, probably not for about 40 or 50 years. There's a lot of things that I've forgotten. In fact, as a boomer, I tell people that the art of forgetting is what's going to be coming up next. Is learning how to forget things better. So you can learn some new things fast. Now, here's 16 new things. Don't need to worry about this list. I'm going to show you them one at a time. But these are based on these new affordances. So let's have a look. So the first one that we can do is microblogging and text messaging. And if you're younger, you already do this a lot. If you're older, maybe not so much. But most people right now know about Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn and all those other things. And the picture here on the right, of course, is the plane that was landed in the Hudson River. And the first picture that went out a good hour before the media got there was from somebody's cell phone on a ferry sent out to TwitPic. Okay? So you see that that's powerful. If there's something happens somewhere, we hear about it through Twitter very quickly, much more quickly than we do through traditional media.